Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you enjoyed your lunch. My name is Jennifer DeClue, and I'm an assistant professor at Smith College. I teach in the Gender Studies department. Just finishing up my third year there, and I work on Black women in cinema, avant-garde, Hollywood cinema, mainstream experimental films, and I think about the presence of the past and the present, and the kind of working through that we do in cinema when it comes to racial sexual violence in the contemporary. So it is my pleasure to introduce our keynote artist, Roshini Kempadoo. She is a photographer, a media artist, a scholar based in London who currently teaches at the University of East London. She has widely published critical analysis that can be found in academic journals like the Journal of Media Practice and Small Acts, and is in anthologies such as Projecting Migration, Transcultural Documentary Practice. As an artist, her work has been included in art books and closely read and scholarly texts that bring together Black, British diaspora artists who interrogate identity, place, and modernity, such as Jen Doy's Black Visual Culture, Modernity, and Postmodernity, and the Studio Museum of Harlem's Race in Digital Space. In her most recent book-length publication, Creole in the Archive, Imagery, Presence, and the Location of the Caribbean Figure, that was published in 2017. So in her work, Roshini Kempadoo imbricates still and moving imagery in such ways that together they create collages of texture and pace in the digital landscape. Her approach of layering text upon photography, upon digital video, raises questions about time and belonging. She provokes the viewer to engage with the history of colonial violence in the Caribbean that tracks back and forth through diasporic movement and displacement and escape. Raising questions about the relationship between fact and fiction, history and memory, her work captures the haunting presence of the Caribbean and Black Britishness through her pieces that study the built environment, that problematize currency, and perform investigations of the archive. Please join me in welcoming the artist and scholar Roshini Kempadoo.
Put this timer on here, just so that I can keep track. Okay, let me just put this on. So, good afternoon, everyone, and thanks to everyone for being here, and it's a great pleasure to be here, to be with you. And particularly thanks, I have to say it, thanks again, thanks to Kimberly for inviting me. It's a fantastic opportunity. I've had a kind of a long ongoing relationship with African-American women. This is where I gather my strength from, and I started with an internship in 91. So I'm not going to reveal my age, but we're talking about historical connections. And I then also had the great pleasure of working with Deb Willis at the Schomburg Center, which was expanding at the time, and I researched the Van der Zee collection with her. So I had the fantastic opportunity of actually being welcomed into a set of African-American sisters, and now I continue that with you guys. So thank you so much for that. And it's always a great pleasure to be here. So I guess I'm just going to refer to my title. My work is about creating, writing, researching, and teaching as what I would describe as noise. A space to question, a space to create in order to interrupt and to run interference. So this is really going to be a talk, a discursive artist talk. I kind of wear different hats, so it's not really going to be a scholarly talk at all in terms of talking about the substance of my book. So it's more a kind of a note and an informal presentation in that sense. So what I want to do is to try and look at and really evoke some of the issues around the aesthetics that I use, the techniques of production, And then I was going to do a short kind of situational or contextual narrative, which I call the backstory of, who influenced my work and how it kind of came into being and when. And then to explore an underlying motif into the content, which is called imagining narratives. And really, in particular, the motif or the kind of undercurrent is always in relation to history. So I want to look at the relationship to history, if you like. So just to move on to thinking about exploring techniques of productions and my aesthetics, really. So here you have an installation shot of an interactive piece. There are 5 pebbles that you move. They have little trigger buttons underneath them. It's an interactive piece. And I'm going to get a couple of pieces in just to show you the kind of audiovisual elements, if you like, to that. So it projects onto a single screen, and it's really work that's gone off the printed kind of exhibition space and into a projected space, if you like. So underneath this is a computer that is then working with it. And in effect, you move the stones in order to hear the stories. So it's an audiovisual sense, and with an ambition to, if you like, delimit the image's connection to the real. As manipulated constructions, as exhibition prints, I extend this to stop animation interactive narratives on single and triple screens. So I'll just show you a piece from this. This is actually one of the pieces. And I have to play this from my own computer. I'm working on software that's very old. It was made in 2004. So this is the issue that we are dealing with, really, in a way. So I'm holding down, holding down and simulating what you would do if you were actually in the space movement.
Samson de Boissier's will. First, I declare that I am sole owner of the small townhouse in Greenwich, London, and the estate in Grenada called Thelside, formerly planted in coffee, but at present abandoned. I am also owner of a small dwelling in Laventille, in the suburbs of Port of Spain, Trinidad, and joint proprietor of a parcel of land in Trinidad, consisting of 700 acres, situation in the same quarter used as a garden for the Negroes of the Champs-Élysées estate. I declare that it is my wish that this parcel of land be given to Jean-Baptiste Philippe in exchange and for the balance of my total debt, realizing the impossibility of adjusting otherwise, having lost my books and papers. Second, I bequeath to my wife Isabel the house in Greenwich, London, and to my first daughter born, Amy, 3,000 Portuguesas, which sum is to be paid to her on her majority, and which is to be guaranteed by all my properties, bearing interest at the rate of 6% for her upkeep and education. Third, I declare that I have 2 natural children by the negress Elsie, living at present in Laventille, both baptized in Trinidad by the minister of the parish on the 3rd of April 1792, under the names of Marie-Louise and Victoria May. Fourth, I declare that I give to negress Elsie her liberty, and my wish is that she enjoy all that is possible after my decease. I give to her and bequeath the domicile in Laventille, Port of Spain, 50 Portuguesas, all my clothes and household furniture. Fifth, I give and bequeath to the girl mulatress Marie-Louise, my daughter, the sum of 300 Portuguesas, which sum is to be paid to her on her majority, and which is to be guaranteed by all my properties, bearing interest at the rate of 6% for her upkeep and education.
And so it reverts back to then you moving another stone in order to listen to the other stories. And they're all interconnected stories emanating from a family, a kind of a group of people who I imagined in the space of, and really who've come from the history books. So it's a kind of a fictional narrative that's dramatized from what I was reading in the historical books. So just to go back here. So, I mean, it's just to give you a sense of how I work with the material, in effect. And in effect, I took photographs that were taken in the Trinidad Country Club. I, in effect, researched maps that were actually in the planning office in Port of Spain in order to make the piece. And as I said, I was working with director in relation to that. So it's about the relationship. There's something interesting around the relationship of the black colonial subject. And of course, the story really emanates from the kind of the primal scene, if you like, of the plantation, the intimate plantation house and space. So it's a narrative that you can get hold of if you keep moving the stones, if you listen to it, if you understand and get a sense of the relationship of the subjects, if you like. So just to move on to showing you some of the images from ECU, which is the European Currency Unfolds, and to return to the work, really, and to just talk a little bit about some of the significant bodies of work I've produced since 1992. So it's safe to say that they are in your face, bold colours, drawing on popular culture. I'm very interested in that relationship to popular culture and meaning, and quick fix meanings, if you like, that could be easily read and drawn attention to. And I think that that's something that it really comes from my photographic and filmic background, if you like, that's actually been influential. And here you can see how big the sizes of those images are and how they actually work in the exhibition space. So you probably have no idea what it meant to create these images back in 1992. It was an idea, you know, some of them are actually, you know, I was working with first versions of Photoshop, for example. We had very, very small file sizes, and then we were working to produce negatives from them, so 5 by 4 inch negatives, which then went back into conventional prints. And of course, this makes absolutely no sense to anybody who's actually a lot younger, but in effect, we went through. And I was thinking very much about this idea of the technology in that sense. So they're created from existing published images, combining them with my own to create a hybrid form. I always really usurped and took published existing images. And then, of course, there are also banknotes that are scanned in. There's issues around copyright, so those are the kinds of things that you have to engage with when you work with usurping and reusing imagery in that way. So it starts off with the documentary approach, people, events, landscapes, working in the studio and the darkroom to construct images, adding text, which becomes really significant, and with the colours and brashness of money and corporate capital. And this is another one. So at the time, I was making them when they were actually associated with this emergence of the European Union and the idea of the single currency, which, of course, Britain never joined, right? So there was this really interesting debate around it, and which came from that. So I just thought, on the brave, I'll show you this one, which I posted on Facebook rather than anywhere else, but it was actually on the eve of the vote, the Brexit vote in Britain in 2016. And you can see here I worked with multiple sets of images, and this is kind of putting these together and still rehearsing this kind of European identity, if you like, and the issues for the issues for the racialized body in relation to that. And this is the text that I put with it. We can wildly imagine for one moment that in the years that follow, hundreds of bankers will go to jail, and that we are no longer being exploited by a naturalized economy that redistributes from the poor to the rich, or that debt is something that can be paid off. We are broke and living with brokenness. And that's really from Fred Moten's work. But in our crazy, ranting language, we can laugh at these 6 jokes and continue to listen to the noise of subversion and to speak from a space and time which is here. So you can see how there's some underlying kind of issues of labor, issues of the racialized body in relation to labor that I continue to kind of look at. So just to show you how writing becomes an integral part of me trying to, if you like, expand the photography or photographs in a way. So it's actually delimiting photography that I'm very interested in doing. And these were really inspired. The idea of lapping it up, of course, was coming from somebody like Bell Hooks and Deborah Willis's writing on sexuality and blackness. And I worked with a poet who's now in his 70s, Mark Matthews, who I grew up with, who's a performer of poetry and did a number of very significant kind of readings, if you like, with other poets, evoking Creole language, so Jamaican, Trinidadian, around the Caribbean during the 70s. Of course, that was a time post-independence, etc. So working with Creole language and Jamaican, Trinidadian, or Guyanese is really important to me to think about that idea of a different kind of stylistic form. And the one thing about Creole language, in particular, is this idea of the fictional space in it, which is absolutely fantastic to work with and to listen to and to incorporate. And of course, that kind of language is absolutely part of our post-colonial literature. Right? It's absolutely embedded in British Caribbean literature in all forms, and we can see that through Maurice Condé, Andrew Salkey, George Lamming, for example, or a newer generation of Edward Tanticat and Lorna Goodison, for example. So working with text, I'm not going to read this, I mean, you may not be able to get it, but so it's really kind of working with Mark in relation to thinking about this notion of the return home and how, the expansion of consumerism, if you like, of rapid consumerism in the form of tourism, Caribbean tourism. So Kelli Jones, art historian, critic, and scholar, some time ago in her essay, Recreation, which was published in 1990 as well in Art Forum, she explored my work among that of other black women photographers. And she said much of the work of this photography and text work has to do with making ourselves visible, of redefining the image position of the woman person of colour in the large discourse. Reterritorialization includes recapturing one's combined and various history, much of which has been dismissed as an insignificant footnote to the dominant culture. These objects, then, construct and redefine their maker's own relationship in the world. And that's a quote from there. So I just wanted to move on to kind of give you a sense of the kind of variety of stuff that I've done. I also worked and was very much interested in, at the time, making internet and web-based artworks as well. And of course, that was a very interesting space at the time, and this is 2000, particularly to do with this notion of white flight, right? So there was something where the internet had become this kind of democratic virtual space that for some reason was not actually inhabiting an embodied kind of racialized discussion in it. And Maria Fernandez, I don't know if some of you will know her writings, really raised that as an issue of, saying, well, where is that discussion about post-colonial discourse in relation to the internet, the discussions around and theorization of the internet and the expansion of the internet. So one of the things that I did with this Virtual Exiles project was to to create a software, and again thinking about the exhibition at the ICA Art in the Age of the Internet from 1989 to today that we saw in the reception at the ICA last night. There's something about the carcasses that are actually around in the digital world where in effect we're working with redundant technologies, hardware that doesn't exist, software like Netscape here that's disappeared, and in effect these projects then become archived or go into these kind of spaces of redundant things. So it's very nice to have seen that exhibition last night, actually, and to see some of that work that I was very familiar with. So along with this aesthetic comes other questions involving both the process of enunciation and the practice of the critical image. And you can see some of the further websites. So people go onto the website and they can interact with it. They could upload images. So there were workshops that were actually part of the possibility of the internet site being in the exhibition space itself, and people being able, workshops of teenagers, also exploring notions of identity, displacement, diasporic presence, if you like. Because virtual exiles kind of cut across a range of communities and a range of different people, particularly in London and where it travelled to. So for me, there is something about the idea of the aesthetic and the critical image, the development of the critical image. What lies beyond the frame, what is absent, how may the photographic documentary genre become problematized, what other references may it allude to for a more complex reading and interpretation. And of course, things like loops, repetition become an integral part of making of that work, and the idea of that online environment as well. And of course, as you saw earlier with the ghosting, I was very, very much interested in the idea of tactility and the haptic. And people really enjoyed kind of holding on to those stones and moving them in a way. So as Ashwani Sharma writes about my work, it is the liminal space, opened up by technological splicing. Kempadoo's photo constructions are a dense, multimedia, labyrinthine flow of still images through which the diasporic artist interrupts and recontextualizes the present. Her work offers a disjunctive and dislocated political vision of everyday survival and struggle in contemporary globalization. Her electronic processes of production, distribution, and exhibition recontextualizes the still image. And this was part of a retrospective show and an essay from that. So I want to just show you a couple of pieces from a work I've made in 2015. So this is working with internet version 3, 2, whatever, maybe 3. Some people now call it version 3. And again, not necessarily putting the work online, but it's actually really thinking, and I was thinking about somebody, Amanda, I think it was, who was actually showing some work where she posts them. This goes into the gallery space, and it's called Face Up. So I was very interested in the idea of the selfie in that way. So on the screen, for me, these images now become the still moving image, a term used by Cheryl Finley and I in discussion to describe the animation and sequencing, if you like, that actually then, in effect, my work embodies, that it isn't actually about, I'm thinking about being influenced by sequence images that, somebody like Victor Bergen has kind of suggested in the remembered film. The screen for multimedia artwork the complexity is emergent from the still image with the oral visual techniques and aesthetics, an interactive constructed layered and multiple. And of course, we can think about Hall in relation to that, where he talks about the fixed meanings of the documentary image while engaged with a practice that went against the grain of realism. And he talks about that in the work in 10.8 very much. So it was actually throwing up that. So I see my work as continuing that. So these are some screen grabs from Face Up. And this is a recent work that was curated by Paul Goodwin in 2015. And then it came to Newark in 2016. The project is concerned with our use of the phone, which has to be, in my view, has triggered a new way of looking at our bodies, ourselves, and others. So if you think about the screen now, I'm working on the vertical, right? So it's very interesting to see the way in which the smartphone becomes a kind of a more vertical construction, still in the 16:9 ratio. So there's something very interesting about working with that technique as well. And I think about different editing techniques associated with how we move through images on our phones, different techniques of movement. So these, again, are fictional stories based on what I called eavesdropping. One of the things that we all do is sit down and we can hear other people's conversations on their smartphones. I particularly do that in London on the tube. And it's just one of those things where you start imagining what the end of the stories are. They're unbelievable. So that was the basis of the work that I went on. So it's like overhearing, overseeing whilst on the go. As with many other techniques of production, I engage with the possibility of stories that emanate from and are dramatizations, of everyday life experiences. So you just can see a couple here. And again, there were about 6 stories that I produced, and I'll just show you a piece from called Nana. It's silent, by the way. It's actually a piece that I decided not to work with sound at all, for all kinds of reasons, really, which we can have a discussion about. But so I'll just show you this. So that's just to give you an idea of one of the stories. And as you can see, I'll just go back to here. That's good timing, actually. So I was very interested in the way, and obviously one of the interesting things I'm trying to work with is the idea of the viral image and how we think about that. And of course, that's the source of the Shakara in 2015. You would be very familiar with the Spring Valley High School incident in South Carolina, which of course went viral across. But I'm very interested in the way in which we actually think through how we actually make meaning and the multiple ways in which meaning is made through these kinds of cacophony, if you like, of imagery and material that we receive through the phone. So just to move on to thinking about, to give you a historical context and the issue of activism and cultural work, and some of you will be very familiar with the area of identity politics in the 1980s, and yes, I came from that kind of space. So these slides reflect some of the collective groups and resource bases I was involved in, notably Autograph APB, the London Photographic-based agency in which came together in 1988, 10/8 as an independent and international photographic journal, and Format as a women's-only photographic agency. So as a cultural activist associated with activism in Britain during the 1990s, or rather late 1980s to 1990s, in photography and film, I was very much influenced with an international network and support of African-American photography as well, with people like Kelli Jones, Coco Fusco, Bell Hooks, etc., Michelle Wallace, where that kind of debate was being had around how we actually think about issues of presentness, issues of identity, and how we think about that in an international kind of way. So some of you will be very familiar with the historical context of the term black as associated in Britain during that period of time as encompassing African, Asian, Arabic, and Caribbean, people of African, Asian, and Arabic and Caribbean descent as it relates to our cultural identity formations. And this is well published and well known, I'm hoping. And of course, it was from the late 80s. And you're probably aware of the legacy of this period of activism that actually occurred during this time. It was a very short but intense time. Stuart Hall was very instrumental to this process, but it meant that the legacy of it was a very positive influence, it seems to me, on Britain's archives, on Britain's institutions, in relation to expressions and collections as more multiracial in their orientation, and reflecting a more culturally diverse population living in Britain. So as a countercultural discourse during a period of disturbance, that was the Thatcher years, of course, Black British cultural history has been written about and acknowledged. Blackness, then, had political and cultural agency and was widely used by Black activists, artists, politicians, theorists, and producers. And, of course, this has since kind of become very fragmented. It was a short-lived kind of experience where that kind of notion of collaborative and collective project happened. It then kind of subsequently comes to define an African-centered people of descent or populations of descent. So this period was marked by a notion of a commitment to cultural activism, and God alone knows that we now need it again, I think, in terms of what's happening now. And political and social agency. Of course, there were lots of other things going on. There were lots of debates about the kinds of aesthetics that were being used and the kinds of work that was being produced and how you talk about the aesthetics being associated with the black subject, the black British subject. But I was very interested, and my role was very much about the organising, creating separate autonomous agencies at the time, such as Autograph, and places like Format, which is the only ever women's picture agency where I kind of came from as a graduate student and was working with women in relation to that. And this is a photograph that's now in the National Portrait Gallery. And, of course, I also worked with 10/8, which was an independent photographic magazine and journal, and some of those debates that we were having as part of that, to think through the impact and how you might think about redefining photography and Black British photography was very much in the focus of that. So we were marshalling the arguments for art, film and television institutions and governmental funding bodies to recognise Black British for their contributions and talent as audiences and practitioners, but also demanding resources, right? And demanding to get into the institutions. And it was very hard work, right? So it was very interesting. And now, of course, we now see that that's kind of become quite established. But very much on the process that it's precarious, right? That we have unprecedented numbers of people of colour coming into academic institutions, and what's happening? They start to cut the funding, right? So you start getting this kind of revisionist occurrence in Britain and in Europe in relation to the very hard work that we did at that point in time. So lastly, I just want to touch on my artworks and its relationship to history and archives and memory. And as you can see, you have got a sense that I have always kind of wrangled with this idea of history, particularly as it relates to Caribbean visual culture. And some of this thinking is published in my book, which some of you might know, The Creole in the Archive, Imagery, Presence, and Location of the Caribbean Figure. So among other matters in the book, I reconceptualized the notion of archives as contiguous and relational. And I'm exploring the notion of creolization as a practice and methodology for doing this. Right? So it's quite a complex kind of way of thinking about the idea of the notion of the archives. And this really comes from my kind of interdisciplinary kind of influences, if you like, and profession, where thinking through a cultural studies moment for photography, but also thinking through the connection that I have to the Caribbean, and also the idea of how limiting, if you like, the existing archive material I researched in Trinidad was to me. It didn't tell my story. It was actually, we have financial accounting systems that actually are the historical documents that we have to work with. There are very, very few narratives that belong to the everyday experience of people who are indentured or who are ex-slaves or from slavery, particularly in the Caribbean. So these were documents that are really not particularly existing, and of course they also exist within the Empire in England, right? So I was researching archives in Trinidad and looking at the residual colonial archive within Trinidad, and of course what exists there is secondary, of course, to what really exists in Britain. So it's very interesting to see. I can't go into this work too much at this point in time. Perhaps we can have a discussion about it at some point. But it's really about thinking through how the relationship and interconnectedness that we can make of archive material to contemporary visual artworks at this point in time in order to reread the archives. So the contiguous archive is thinking through a more expanded notion of the archive that coexists without a hierarchy of structure, of historical, factual documents being of more importance to contemporary artworks, but actually putting them almost under erasure through a contemporary artwork. Right? How do you put them under erasure through a contemporary artwork, and how do Caribbean artists do that? And of course they do. And that's through the introduction of a fictional space, through the introduction of a poetic space, and through delimiting, if you like, or putting under question the factual accuracy of those documents, right? Because they are documents of financial accounting of a plantation system. So just to return to ghosting here to explore historical interference, and as you can see, it's a persistent theme in my work. So I researched Trinidadian visual material, and this idea of there being a coherent structure is, of course, mythical. It's fragmented. It always contains the colonial frame in it. I mean, the interesting thing about Trinidad, and as a newly independent country, relatively new, it is very quick to bury a colonial archive, or colonial archives in that sense. The story begins from the point of independence. Eric Williams comes into power. We have enormous amounts of collections of work from that. And so colonialism is always given a very particular take in relation to that. And so I'm kind of thinking about the archive as always containing the colonial, and how do you deal with it? And so for me, it's always been about looking at these images. And of course, some of you will be very familiar with this kind of material that you find in the album, for example. This is one. These are highly staged constructions, right? They're absolutely, from the perspective of the colonizers and landowners. And one of the things I do in the book is to analyze images like these to think about that. And I haven't brought a lot of them, but these are ones that I've researched in Trinidad. And then, of course, we kind of move on to the kind of postcard that some of you will be very familiar with. And the postcard then becomes a very important kind of visual space of constructing the Caribbean and the visual appearance of the perspective and imagination of the Caribbean. And I think about the term tropicalization that Krista Thompson uses and has developed in order to make meaning of them, from them. As being mythical, colonial, and problematic visualization of the Caribbean, where tropical landscapes were engendered through complex visual histories of fantastical and imaginative constructs that, and I quote, conform to exoticized and fantastic ideals of the tropical landscape. And so there's something very interesting about the way in which these images, and I'm sure Tina will talk more about this in relation to this notion of repetition, how these images, the types of images that come into circulation and are being used as postcards to be sent back to Britain as people take their holidays and experience the tropics. So I started looking for other types of images. I just found that rehearsing and looking at the limit of the archives, the existing official archives, was a real problem for me. So I started looking at them, and of course, the going to particular individual family members, and to think about the family album imagery and studio portraiture as being absolutely key to that. So that's about a recovery and thinking through that. So I've just brought you a couple here from Mr. Della Costa's archive, who I interviewed and then kind of thought about. And there's something very interesting about this kind of change that starts happening with the self-imaged kind of process, if you like, of the family album or the high street photographic portraits, where there is a self-determination inherent in the kind of the position of the sitter, how she wants to position herself and exist. It's the process, and of course there's a long debate about this kind of humanization process with it, but again, I found that it was a really important way in which to think about the recovery of the everyday and the representation of people like my parents' descendants. So I went from going door to door, finding and interviewing owners of high street photographic studios. Our history was, on the whole, constituted as financial documentation. So it was important to think about how to work with these images. So family photography collections and the memories and narrated stories, so often embellished as good stories often are, that emanate from such photographs, are also important to the way in which we might recover. And I don't have a problem when somebody starts telling me a story about a photograph. I think that's absolutely fantastic. It's embellished, it's enriched. If you were to read the Looking for El Dorado and Walter Raleigh, Looking for Gold, these are incredibly fantastical kind of narrations, right? So we don't have, so this kind of idea of the slippage between the poetic and the fictional and the imaginative is always embedded in the photographs, always embedded in the visual. So to quote and to just think about the photographs, the family album, the importance of the family album image, photographs taken in everyday, snapshots in particular, and I'm quoting her here, rebelled against all of those photographic practices that reinscribed colonial ways of looking and capturing the images of the black other. These snapshots gave us a way to see ourselves, a sense of how we looked, and we are not wearing the mask. So just to go back to these ghosting images, the Contiguous Archive for me then is the Creole in the archive, places contemporary artworks as contributions to memories and past narratives. It is to do with the ways in which we are able to make sense of contemporary artworks, for their materiality and aesthetic, as well as their progressive interpretive qualities of historical and contemporary re-narrations of social and cultural life. And I haven't brought any of those other images of other artists' work that I work with and I have interviewed and kind of collected, if you like. So I explore Caribbean artists, including people like Christopher Cozier, Nadia Huggins, Stacey Tyrell, Nicole Awai. And so many of you may know these people because they are people who move between the Caribbean and often as artists are also here. And it seems to me, ironic, in a very interesting way, the States has really kind of been able to kind of support the way in which Caribbean artists are coming onto the global scene in very interesting ways. So I'm thinking about the recent show, for example, Relational Undercurrents, the contemporary art of the Caribbean archipelago, which is curated recently by Tatiana Flores and Michelle Stevens at the Museum of Latin American Art in Los Angeles. And the work of Small Axe, a Caribbean Journal of Criticism, which I'm involved in as well. So these are very different stories and perspectives, and they're centralizing, it seems to me, queer, non-gendered, feminist Caribbean bodies. And I think that's, to me, is where the most exciting and most progressive kind of forms of memory and forms of recovery of historical or historical questions are brought in to the work. So I just want to end and conclude, and I'm thinking about the term which I remember reading about from Annie Paul, who's a Jamaican academic and scholar and was involved in Small Axe. Some of you might know her. And she talks about, and she was interviewing Christopher Cozier, and she was talking about this idea of a term, and of course a term that you might describe artists who are really problematizing and questioning some of the kind of the more conventional narratives of mainstream representations of the Caribbean. So she uses the term the alternatives, and she uses that to describe Chris Cozier's work, but also being as alternatives, being the illegitimate children of the nation, who by virtue of differing race, class and gender or sexual variables find themselves on the wrong side of the nation's stories in opposition to the majority groups that assert ownership of the national or Caribbean space. So I guess what she's also suggesting is that it's bringing into question this idea of nationhood in all kinds of ways and beginning to posit alternative kind of namings and identifications of Caribbean artists and their relationship to the Caribbean space. So I'm going to leave it there, and I'm hoping we have time for some questions. But thank you very much.
I was wondering about the voices in the piece that you showed earlier.
Yeah.
Who are the voices? Are the voices different for the different narratives? Are you matching or mapping the voices in any particular way?
They're different voices. So we did we worked with a kind of a script that was put together by Mark and a couple of other people, and then we had readings. And in fact, the voice that you heard was a woman of the Trinidad diaspora living in London who's a lawyer, who read that for me. So it's trying to find and trying to work with a range of people who are of Caribbean origin in order to kind of evoke that. So we work with, for example, the central stories are really around the women's narratives. So from the history books, I was always hearing the male narrative, right? That these people existed, Debussy existed, etc. And so for me, it was about, you know, the other story, which is how do I and can I evoke the women's presence in that? So the central characters are women in that sense.
Just thank you so much for your work. I'm so glad that I got to hear you talk about your career. And just looking at this image, I have a question about your use of layers. You didn't show this, but there are a few videos where there's movement happening over a still image, and it's kind of staccato. Yeah. So I'm really curious about your use of layers in images, and some still and some moving, and you could maybe talk about process or how you arrived at this way of expressing multiplicities of time or place, or the in-betweenness, the creolization.
Thank you. I guess it's the kind of frustration of the single image, really, in a way, that's driven me to this kind of work. And I've always done that ever since I finished graduate school and then went on to do a photographic MA, is to think about the limit of the single image. And the problem that I had was that I was trained as a documentary photographer, and the ways in which they were being used by format, for example, were actually as photojournalists' images in publications, small independent publications. And the captions that editors would put to them were absolutely unbelievable. I mean, they would actually implicate the people in the images all the time. It was incredibly eye-opening to see the limitations of that photojournalistic form. So for me, there was always something about a more directed kind of focus for the work, but also the idea of how do you kind of think about the other narratives that you might be able to get into the frame and how that works with that. So I always think about so this is made up, for example, of two images, and it's part of a piece that actually moves. So she enacts. And one of the things that I do is to ask professional actors, and I work with green screen. So it's partly in After Effects or Photoshop that I work with these things of layering, and green screen has become quite an important kind of part of that. I'm very interested in the way in which that can be complemented by voice or text. And so partly in leaping off from the printed image, the idea of working with sound became quite an important aspect of it, and how you might think about not necessarily embodying and visualizing the character or the person or the figure all the time. That actually the problem is that the identification to the figure occurs very easily and very quickly. So you would then probably say, this is this particular person, oh, she's talking about her. But actually, I then kind of disrupt that again. So I think I give you a sense of a figure, and I was very interested in the debate of when you put something into the visual or not. And so I've worked very much with historical material and removing them. And just thinking about ways in which to get a historical language, if you like, into the space through the oral or the written as well. So it's just trying to expand that notion of the almost literalness of that image in the way, and the limit of the still image.
Thank you for your presentation. Have you reflected on, from my point of view, it seemed to be work you've done in the past that have moments right now, such as the European Union and your work with the ECU, and then the thinking about your earlier work when you were looking at the using the digital format as a way of, thinking when people thought about the internet as a place for democracy and conversation, especially now it's happening with, Facebook, and then with the, what's happening in the European Union. Do you reflect back on those works differently, or do you think, this is what I was thinking when I was doing it, that they would be moments?
Yeah, I mean, I think that you do have to put them within a historical context, because actually there was an incredible amount of debate about the democratization of the internet, right? Of how this process of you being able to give your voice and visibility in relation to that. And the piece that I first did on the internet was the Virtual Exiles piece, which was where I was coming across, I mean, Guyana is a place where at a certain moment it had a population, a birth rate still growing, and the population was decreasing. That's because everybody was moving out of Guyana. And so what was very interesting was how the internet was being used, and I was part of that discussion about the internet at that time being used to rehearse Guyanese, what it means to be Guyanese, and what it means to be as part of that diaspora. So for me, at that time, it was really interesting. It became a space for a diasporic kind of identity formation space, right? Which actually then made sense at the time. And of course, we're now in a completely different space in relation to the internet and Facebook. And I'm just very, very interested that those vertical pieces were really trying to see a way in which I can embed a different level of editing process and reflection on the complexity of, I think it was raised earlier, of the kind of narcissistic stroke, communication stroke, making meaning and our visual experience coming from the smartphone. So how do we actually and of course it's incredibly, it's the first place where we make meaning of the world, right, in a way. So, it's incredibly important to think through what that is. And I haven't got any kind of solutions about what, I don't think people are writing very well about what it is that's going on and the lasting effect of that process, it seems to me. But and of course there is this issue of security, which I think has been raised more recently. But this is a leaky technology. It's not going to go away. It's always going to exist. We're always going to be using it, despite, if you speak to younger people, they haven't had anything else, right? So they're not going to remove themselves from Facebook. So for me, there's been, and it was very interesting to see how they thought about FaceUp when I showed the piece. People were going, "Oh, I get it. You're just hashtagging stuff," and and those snippets were deliberately kind of timed to understand how long you might read them for and where they made sense. So it's very interesting to see, to reflect on the differences between the two.
Hi, thank you again. I have a question about the eavesdropping bit. Do you actually, do you have online social media profiles, or do you eavesdrop and go into these sites and do research to gather material? No. Okay.
The way in which I've been doing is literally on the tube, going up and down through London and listening to stories. So one of the things that I have, for example, is a piece that I overheard, or I was on a bus, and I overheard somebody having a conversation about having to sort their visa out in order to bring somebody over to London, for example, for healthcare reasons. And again, it kind of recurred in my own family as well. So I was just looking for those kinds of stories that are prompting the way in which we navigate the space, the urban space on the one hand, and how we navigate that with Facebook, but also the possibilities. So the stories don't have any end. I don't know what happens in the stories, but it's actually really interesting to just, for me, very, very enriching and telling to listen to those stories and imagine what the ending might be. So that's how I kind of come about thinking about the stories and write them. So no, it's not a kind of social science kind of approach of thinking that in that way. I mean, we all do it, don't we? I mean, we all listen to those things, and particularly we have obviously the public transport process is slightly different.
One more? Thank you. It's very powerful to hear the Boissier narratives about owning plantations. I declare that I have this house, who will get this land, in a week where the Windrush generation has been in the news because of deportations. And so you're asking us to think about the histories of and the discourses around who owes what to whom. Yeah. In the present, when the British nation making would rather forget about the imperial indebtedness. So thank you very much for your work.
No, and thank you for asking that, for making that comment. I mean, I think these things are, land ownership and the issue of what happened after slavery and indentureship, in terms of compensation, in terms of who got what. Is it's the legacy that we're all working with at this point in time, right? So it really, really is important. And part of the piece on the Face Up actually rehearses the issue of the Windrush generation, which is my father's generation, coming over in the 50s. So thinking about the idea of the presence of nurses who are working and doctors who are working in the NHS. And the idea of just raising the issue of, this kind of traffic that always happens of descendants of the Caribbean coming to the UK for hospital care, etc., because of course people need to, and the absolute investment that has been made in the NHS by Caribbean people in it. So, I try to raise some of those issues. And of course, you're absolutely right. It's really pertinent. And they reckon there's over 10,000 people who are going to be affected in England by this kind of process at the moment of the losing of papers, right? Well, thank you.
Sconic. Dr. Tara Bynum is an assistant professor of African American literature and culture. She received a B from Barnard College and an MA and PhD degrees in English from Johns Hopkins University. She teaches African American literature courses that seek after the many ways that people experience Blackness as a racial identity and as a cultural category or as a mark upon the skin. At a time when social media responds to the deaths of unarmed Black men and women with hashtag Black Lives Matter, her courses question, what makes life matter? What literature is and what race or culture means historically and at present? These questions find their way into her book project, Reading Pleasures, which examines the ways in which 18th century enslaved and or free men and women feel good or experience pleasure in spite of the privations of slavery, unfreedom, or white supremacy. Her research and writing have received generous financial support from the National Endowment for the Humanities, American Antiquarian Society, Library Company of Philadelphia, Rutgers University, University of Pennsylvania's McNeil Center for Early American Studies, and the College of Charleston. Her essays have appeared in Commonplace, Legacy, J19, Criticism, and American periodicals. Oh, no, I'm sorry. Just kidding myself. Bakirathi Mani is Associate Professor in the Department of English Literature at Swarthmore College. Mani received her PhD in Modern Thought and Literature from Stanford University, her MA in Modern Indian History from Jawaharlal Nehru University, and her BSFS in Non-Western History and Diplomacy from Georgetown University. She is the author of Aspiring to Home, South Asians in America. Her essays have been published in American Quarterly, Social Text, The Journey of Asian American Studies, Diaspora, and Positions. Her current book project, Haunting Visions, South Asian Diasporic Visual and Exhibition Cultures, considers how images of empire have become archetypes of self-representation in diaspora. She recently curated Ruins and Fabrication, an exhibition of contemporary photography featuring the artists Anna Palakunathu, Matthew, and Gwari Gill of 12 Gates Gallery, Philadelphia, at 12 Gates Gallery. Kelli Moore is assistant professor at NYU in the Department of Media, Culture, and Communication, where she examines the role of media technology in the production of legal and political knowledge. She is at work on a monograph about courtroom mediation that examines the role of the image in facilitating the performance of witness testimony in domestic violence cases. She earned her PhD in communication at the University of California, San Diego, and Kelli is a former University of California President's Postdoctoral Fellow in Rhetoric at Berkeley. Her work can be found in Angelistica, Reviews in Cultural Theory, and Feminist Surveillance Studies. Jyoti Puri is professor of sociology at Simmons College. She writes and teaches at the crossroads of sociology, sexuality, and queer studies, and post-colonial feminist theory. Her books include Women, Body, Desire in Post-Colonial India, and Encountering Nationalism. She has also co-edited special issues of journals and published numerous articles and book chapters. Her new book, Sexual States, Governance and the Struggle Against Anti-Sodomy Law in India's Present, is forthcoming with Duke University Press. She is the recipient of fellowships and grants, including a Rockefeller Research Fellowship and a Fulbright Senior Research Award. She served as chair of the section on sex and gender for the American Sociological Association and is currently a co-editor for the Journal for Cult Studies. Please welcome the panel of scholars for this last session.
So good afternoon. Could you all do me a favor? If you have a pen, do you mind holding on to it if you are not holding on to it? And I would love to have you imagine for a moment that it's 1766. Your pen is not full of ink, but instead is a quill pen, and you're an enslaved man named Cesar Lyndon. In front of you is an account book. And you're in Newport, Rhode Island. I'd like for you to take a moment to imagine the scene. I'll fill in the blanks momentarily, but for the time being, just imagine yourself, 1766, your name's Cesar Lyndon, you really like leather breeches and silver buckles, and there's an account book in front of you. You're also 30-something, just to give you a sense of age. Cesar Lyndon's Sundry account book is a collection of lists. There are long lists and short lists of numbers, persons, and events from 1761 to 1771 in an account book that is perfectly sized for list making. Neither too large nor too small, it is well made for the fancy cursive script that Lyndon uses to itemize marriages, deaths, and the sale and acquisition of goods and services. He notes to whom he sells, and in the way of double entry bookkeeping, he separates the debits and the credits. He records debits in the left column and credits are on the right. Lyndon's account holders are notable slave traders, enslaved servants, and free persons in and around Newport who have come to him for various reasons, including copying and food. He sells a lot of root celery, beets, sow pigs, and ketchup. If anyone knows what 18th century ketchup is, please let me know. What may at first glance look customary in early American account books are fairly common is not. What is not common is its author, Cesar Lyndon. Lyndon is, as I've already told you, an enslaved man born on an uncertain day and in an unknown location. His master is a colonial clerk and one-term governor, Josias Lyndon of Newport, Rhode Island. Lyndon is a servant who not only possesses the requisite literacy and penmanship ability to write a list. His handwriting is so good, in fact, that Captain Caleb Godfrey pays him to copy a lengthy letter. He has numeracy, too. Lyndon is a mathematician, a salesman, and a records keeper. He knows how to add, subtract, multiply, and divide numbers, and in particular currency, namely those pounds, shillings, and pence of Rhode Island, but also New York and elsewhere. And just a word on pounds, shilling, and pence. If ever you try to add up pounds, shillings, and pence from the 18th century, know that you'll run into a problem. So the fact that he can do this, at least by my estimation, is actual genius, because I couldn't figure it out. Housed at the Rhode Island Historical Society, Lyndon's well-kept account book may be the only extant of its kind, namely an 18th century enslaved man's memoranda book. Its genre and Lyndon's bookkeeping skills are noteworthy and compelling. This book isn't simply a diary or a narrative telling of his life. Rather, Lyndon's book invites a consideration of the account book and its lists as genres of storytelling. And it is impossible to ignore his numbers. Numbers litter his dated notations. He creates pricing and numerical value for the slaughter and sale of pigs, beets, and textiles, as well as those items exchanged or received. As items are purchased, he makes note of what he receives in return for his merchandise. Sometimes it's cash, sometimes it's black stockings, sometimes it's pickles and pickled lobster. Anyone had pickled lobster? Sounds disgusting. A linen handkerchief or silk. And when money is owed to him, Lyndon writes letters to request those balances due. Part ledger and part journal, what he collects in numbers and lists on bound and loose paper are stories of Newport's enslaved, free, and local slave traders just a few years before the Revolutionary War. Take, for example, Lyndon's note of Captain Robert Elliot's safe arrival to Newport from Jamaica by way of Philadelphia in the early morning on September 20th, 1768, or the mention of Boston Vose's return from Suriname, August 9th, 1768, with 6 china cups, 6 saucers, and a looking glass yellow around the frame for Lyndon. Lyndon assesses the value of his friend's items as if they were acquired to be sold by him at a later date. On September 13th, 1769, there's a description of Governor Lyndon's accidental fall from his house and his resulting broken collarbone. Lyndon laments too the death of his 2-year-old darling son, Pompey, who dies of the bloody flux on a Wednesday morning in September of 1765. Even though the announcement of his baby boy's death is simple and brief, Lyndon says just enough to witness his grief. Lyndon gathers these stories that leave us to wonder about their plot or even their end result. Admittedly, what he does not say prompts a curiosity that troubles the expectations of this early American literary form. What strikes me as I read his list is that his accounting and his list making refuse the limits of a presentist African American literary tradition. Firstly, Lyndon's account book is easy to find in the Guide to Manuscripts at the Rhode Island Historical Society relating to people of color. Even though it rarely, if ever, makes it into anthologies or literary criticism, it is neither lost nor recovered. Despite its accessibility, at first glance, it might be easy to miss what's exciting about Lyndon's list amidst the rows of names and sow pigs. Because there's an expectation that African American literature must take up resistance or enact agency, one man's list of debits and credits might seem a bit underwhelming or disappointing. It's so often that what we look for in the archive is proof that someone wanted to, in the proverbial words of a favorite 2017 film, get out. But this is a present-day misunderstanding or misguided expectation rather than Lyndon's problem. Instead of resistance or direct action, Lyndon's lists mark everyday living for which we must learn to read that hints at a complicity in the very daily business of slavery. And this complicity is worthy of the sorts of scholarly curiosity that are not simply anchored in disappointment or loss. Lyndon's transactional and quotidian notations require a new way of reading of what is there in the archive or in the special collections library at the Historical Society. In this instance, what is there demands an understanding of 18th century accounting practices, a rethinking of account books as a literary genre, and a willingness to engage with mundanity. Secondly, Lyndon's list disrupts the origin stories of African American literature that begin with either poetry or a narrative of godly salvation. Lyndon precedes Phyllis Wheatley's fame or even her first published poem, and what he recounts is not a slave narrative or a conversion narrative as might be expected. There is no escape, no sordid plot twist, or well-articulated freedom dream. Lyndon's lists are not concerned with proving his humanity or pursuing freedom. Despite what he doesn't say about freedom or even his enslavement, His lists serve him well, even though his chosen form tends to haunt and vex early African-American literary history. Lists in the form of census data, farm books, records of unnamed bodies tend to inventory dehumanization. 18th century lists often remind us what is not said and what we cannot know, a withheld last name, an uncertain birth date, and the certainty of enslavement. These lists name their lack, their refusal to specify and seemingly prove that with every entry, their resulting archive is, in fact, as Saidiya Harman suggests, a tomb. For Lyndon, his list of dates, events, and numbers chronicle 10 years' worth of decidedly ordinary transactions, and it's Lyndon's ordinariness that makes his account book such an extraordinary, well-cataloged find. Lyndon sells everything from rum to silver buckles. He's a one-stop shop for Newport's merchant and seafaring class. He names Newport's most prominent families, Wanton, Champlin, Lopez, Sisson, or Sisson, as account holders. There's the sale of 150 root celery to Aaron Lopez, Newport's prominent Jewish slave trader, on October 29, 1766. The celery cost Lyndon 22 pounds, 10 shilling. To the wealthy Anglican slave trade merchant Christopher Champlin, Lyndon sells 1.5 bushels of beets for 6 pounds. His transactions are extensive and evidence the extent to which Lyndon participates in the emerging capitalist and slaving economy that makes Newport rich and cosmopolitan. Lyndon reaps the benefits of the ever-present ships, captains, and traders that return to the city with an ample harvest of goods from the slave economy. Though it was never meant to be printed, Lyndon's account book glimpses the life of a man whose lists situate him and his literate and numerate reader in a great community of traders, free and enslaved artisans, and servants. His customers return often enough to partake of his goods, and with every return, he itemizes their debits, their remaining balances, and of course the trinkets, textiles, or pigs that are credited to their account. What Lyndon leaves behind in about 32 handwritten pages is a catalog of lists that invites us to wonder just who Cesar Lyndon is and what he has to teach us about early American accounting and living. You should know that Lyndon has friends, and he says so. He courts a wife, and together they must grieve the loss of a baby only 28 months and 8 days old. He goes to weddings and funerals. He counts money and delights in fine china, cups and saucers, and of course, leather breeches. I promise you, between the pigs and the leather breeches, it's amazing how much pork and leather Cesar must consume. Amidst his collectibles and with friends, I find him for the first time because of a list on a summer day in 1766, and that is what you see right here. It's Tuesday, August 12th, 1766, and Cesar Lyndon is having a pig roast. It's just a week after the solar eclipse that has Newport abuzz, even amidst the city's calls to repeal the Stamp Act of 1765. His menu is simple and thorough and itemized. A pig to roast, wine, bread, rum for drink and killing the pig, butter, sugar, tea, and coffee, limes for punch, and green corn. Even though the Rhode Island General Assembly might take issue with his beverage selection or even the number of enslaved persons that far from their respective homes, Lyndon spends quite a bit of pounds, shillings, and pence to host this gathering, not only for his menu, but also the necessary lodging. The pig to roast is valued at 8 pounds, 10 shillings. The room to rent is 7 pounds, 4 shillings. Wine costs him 3 pounds and 12 shillings. Lyndon must, rum to drink and rum to kill the pig is valued at 2 pounds, 10 shillings, and 10 shillings respectively. Lyndon must know that the rum sweetens the meat and, of course, subdues the pig. Lyndon carefully records a line item for each expense and totals his cost at 33 pounds, 13 shillings. And his math is correct. If you try to add that up the way you know how to add, though, it's going to be wrong. Don't be alarmed. That's the plot twist of pounds, shillings, and pence, I learned. Just above his list of purchases is another list, namely his guests. His list of attendees is not long enough, though, just a small group of friends, Boston Vose, Zingo Stevens, Phyllis Lyndon, Neptune Sisson, or Sisson, and his wife, Prince Thurston, and his wife, and of course, Lyndon and Sarah Searing. Lyndon doesn't bother to explain what they have in common or what makes them friends. They are not all the same age, but what is age to someone who may not know his or her birthday? The records would suggest that Phyllis is about 20 years old. Sarah and Neptune are older, in their mid-30s. Zingo's age is unknown, but he does die 51 years later in 1817, which would suggest that on this day, in 1766, he's young enough to live another half century and old enough to love on Phyllis and to roast a pig with his 30-something-year-old friends. Zingo will outlive Phyllis, Cesar Lyndon, and Sisson. Stevens will live longer than his and Phyllis's 2-month-old son, Prince, who dies 2 weeks after his mother in 1773. Sarah Searing will die at 94 in 1826. Her February 9th, 1826 obituary remembers her as a venerable and highly respected woman of color who had a long and respectable life. I've not yet found a way to date Prince Thurston or his wife with no name. Even though their ages are not certain, what they know and do share are their relationships to another and a desire to roast a pig on a Tuesday in Portsmouth. Together, these men and women are friends and for a time lovers. See, this is a couple's trip, but for Boston Vose, whose name appears without an and next to it. Maybe Vose, often at sea, has a friend or love interest to meet in Portsmouth. Lyndon and Searing are not yet married, but they've already lost their son. They will be married lawfully in over a year in 1767 by Ezra Stiles, pastor of Newport's Second Congregational Church and later president of Yale. In the weeks before their marriage, Lyndon remembers that he whitewashed Sarah's bedchamber and painted the woodwork blue. Searing and Lyndon are married just months after Zingo Stevens and Phyllis. Lyndon cites their union Sunday about 2 o'clock. July 20th, 1767, Mr. Zingo Stevens and Miss Phyllis Lyndon, married by the Reverend Edward Upham, pastor of First Baptist Church. Neptune and Prince Thurston are already married. Neptune Sisson's unnamed wife might be Dinah, who, as his widow writes in late 1794 to the Free African Union Society about her husband's membership dues. They get into a whole fight. It's a whole big thing. Lyndon doesn't say much else about what happens on the 12th of August, 1766, or the night before, and certainly not the day after. No travel arrangements, and even though Portsmouth is a few miles north of Newport by land or river, Lyndon makes no line item for the how of their travel, a seemingly important consideration because there's a pig to transport and 9 persons. There's no specific detail. Instead, Lyndon just leaves us to wonder about so much. Admittedly, I still have so many questions about Cesar Lyndon, about what happens on this day, but I'm certainly all the more kind of curious about how to frame his account book, how to make sense of his account book, and ultimately what we should do with his account book in a way that has us rethink what we imagine 18th century African American literature to be or to not be. Thank you.
Bakirathi Mani.
Thank you so much, everyone, for hanging out with us. And Kimberly, I just want to extend a deep gratitude to you for inviting me to be a part of this. It's my first time at the Dark Room, and I have been so enriched by all of your collective work and conversation. So thank you so much. I really cherish that. And also thank you to Vanessa for keeping us on time all day. And I will try and zip through my presentation. Okay. In my book in progress, Haunting Vision, South Asian Diasporic Visual and Exhibition Cultures, I've been writing about the work of South Asian diasporic artists who deploy 19th century and early 20th century photography. Images from family albums, newspapers, government portraits, and landscape surveys to create representations of South Asian America. For racialized diasporic viewers, these images illustrate the fact of empire in all its expansive and terrifying scale. Artifacts of the past, they record another time, another place, documenting the history of a colonized nation far removed from our own. But taken out of the colonial archive that we see as a proper home, these same photographs begin to disorient us. The photographs acquire an uncanny familiarity, as if an element of the image, a body, a building, shrubs in the landscape, a look in someone's eye, is something that we already know. We look and look again at these images, and in that constant looking, we begin to see the photograph as an object that we have already seen before. In our repeated viewings, we acquire a closeness to the image that quite suddenly and unexpectedly shows our proximity to the colonial archive. The object that we're looking at, the visual record of colonial rule in South Asia, slips, turns, and records instead the empire that we live in now, the terrifying and expansive sweep of imperial power that marks us as racialized subjects in the United States. I call this mode of seeing an uncanny vision, a practice of seeing and identifying with South Asian American art that produces the effect of being haunted by empire. The desire to see oneself in the image, I argue, expands the temporal scope of empire, such that empire is not a place in another time, but a feeling that saturates our everyday experience as diasporic subjects. I'm going to turn to the artist Seher Shah's drawing, Geometric Landscapes and the Spectacle of Force. Here, Shah creates a built landscape that haunts the viewer. Skyscrapers, pillars adorned with winged creatures, obelisks and minarets proliferate across the surface of the drawing. Alongside this imaginative landscape, Shah reproduces archival photography of colonial monuments, canopies, amphitheaters, and parade grounds built in Delhi in the early 20th century to commemorate the coronation of the British king and queen as emperor and empress of India. These are the events called the Delhi Darbars. They took place in 1877, 1903, and 1911. And I'll just show you very quickly, these are the canopies and the amphitheaters that I am referring to, and these are the monuments, these skyscrapers. This is what Shah has drawn. It's worth noting, by the way, that Shah could not access the archival photographic images of the Darbars at the National Archives in India. She is an American citizen, but of Pakistani origin, and so she was refused access to the National Archives in India. She had to travel to England for research. So these architectural structures, that is, architectural structures of the Darbar, appear as reverse negative prints, or white on black, and they're immediately doubled. Replicated right side up and upside down, the monuments become mirror images within the print. Creating a strong horizontal line, more photographs emerge. Silhouetted images of cavalrymen holding flags, troops standing at attention, a turbaned soldier floating on the lower foreground of the drawing. In the background, geometric patterns expand and contract in great waves. Spilling across the sightline of the canvas and photographs that are reproduced not once or twice, but up to 10 times, Geometric Landscapes produces a spectacle of imperial violence that, I argue, ties together colonial India with 21st century America. I first encountered Shah's artwork at Nature Mort Gallery in New Delhi at a solo exhibition titled From Paper to Monument. As a Pakistani artist raised in Brussels and in London, a longtime resident of Brooklyn who's now living in New Delhi, this was Shah's first exhibition in India. It was also the gallery's first exhibition by a Pakistani. Trained as an architect at the Rhode Island School of Design, in the mid-2000s, Shah's drawings were frequently exhibited as an example of contemporary art that deploys, and I quote, signs and symbols from Islamic cultures, end quote, or in relation to her presumed identity as a, quote, Pakistani-American, South Asian, and Muslim, end quote, artist. These were the representations of identity that I expected to see in her works on paper. But as I viewed Geometric Landscapes, I was suddenly disoriented. Standing in close proximity to her drawing, I recognized the architectural emblems as photographs of one place, colonial South Asia, even as I stood in a gallery that was itself emblematic of another place, neoliberal India. In the photographs of troops carrying flags, I saw not only the expansive domain of the British Empire on the subcontinent, but, though this was not directly depicted, the steady invasion of US troops into Pakistan and Afghanistan in the 21st century. And in the skyscrapers that punctuated the drawing, I was reminded of still another place, my apartment where I then lived in New York City. Seeing this drawing displayed in an upscale Delhi neighborhood, I found myself in a place and time not removed from the drawing, but utterly immersed in it, as if the drawing reflected the empires that shape my life now. In his reading of Shah's drawings, the art historian Iftikhar Dadi emphasizes how Shah layers hand-drawn calligraphy and ornament on archival images to suggest a dreamscape of imbricated pasts of Muslim, British, and Sikh South Asia that persist in the present as a sequence of uncanny afterimages. Such dreamscapes are the imaginative worlds that bind together distinct national and religious histories, Mughal monuments, British parade grounds, Sikh soldiers, landscapes and figures that are iconic representations of the subcontinent's imperial past. But in describing the persistence of these representations as uncanny afterimages, Dadi also points to the ways in which the viewer is drawn to Shah's work as something familiar, and in its very familiarity, terrifying. Looking at Shah's drawings reminds us of something that we have seen before. Our disorientation in seeing these images is a measure of how close we are, indeed how we might already inhabit the physical and psychic spaces that are mapped within the drawing. Sorry, this was one of the archival images of the amphitheater that's duplicated in the drawing there. Okay. The uncanny is frequently read as a mark of the return of the repressed or as a feeling of dread in relation to human-like figures such as automatons or androids. By contrast, I define the uncanny as a sense of spatial disorientation and abjection in space that emerges out of the subject's failure to see. As Freud notes, the essential factor in the production of the feeling of uncanniness is ascribed to intellectual uncertainty, so that the uncanny would always be that in which one does not know where one is, as it were. The better orientated in his environment a person is, the less readily will he get the impression of something uncanny in regard to the objects and events in it. So I want to stress here the distinction that Freud makes between the uncanny as a measure of intellectual uncertainty and the uncanny as a disorientation in space. And he gives several examples in his 1919 essay, The Uncanny, that highlights how the uncanny links a problem of orientation, physical orientation, to the experience of abjection. So he describes wandering around a dark, strange room looking for the door or for the electric switch and colliding repeatedly with the same piece of furniture. And in contrast to the first example that's in this quote about walking through a forest, this second example takes place within a dark room that renders a domestic space unfamiliar or strange. And reading Freud's quote here really helps me to think about Sarah Ahmed's work on her orientations towards objects, what she describes as a queer phenomenology, walking through dark rooms and bumping into objects there, leaving and taking account of the bodily impressions that such collisions leave on us. In any case, in the forest and inside the dark room, the uncanny emerges in that moment of disorientation where the subject is unable to see or feel a pathway out of a defined space and becomes keenly aware of their orientation as foreign or other or as object within that space. So my viewings of geometric landscapes and the spectacle of forest produce precisely this uncanny effect. Stretching 10 feet across and nearly 5 feet in height, geometric landscapes create a panoramic vision. In my initial viewing, I was compelled by the reproductions of landscape photographs from the darbars, the gateways that are part of the massive amphitheater built for the 1903 darbar, the cupolas that denote the canopied structure occupied during the 1911 darbar, and the processionals of cavalrymen. Along with the silhouetted images of two differently turbaned men in the drawing, each of the photographs reproduced in Shah's work secured my initial impression of the drawing as a representation of quote-unquote India. My identification of the drawing is India, cathects to my identification with the drawing. Because I know this drawing is India, it secures my identity as a South Asian. But as my eyes travel repeatedly across the same structures, from left to right and back again, that representational narrative of the self in relation to the drawing becomes slippery. Across the drawing, the reproduction of the colonial monument is central to a visual narrative that refutes the authority of empire and disseminates its spatial and temporal effects. I want to think for a moment about what else we see in this drawing. Writing on the visual archive created by September 11, 2001, the curator Okwe Nwezor suggests that it is difficult to come to terms artistically with this moment, in part because the images of the crumbling towers and exploding planes were instantly and repetitively broadcast across the world, with the effect that, quote, the images became archival the instant the first footage surfaced, and the need for documentary accounts grew. As Nwezor goes on to note, and I quote, September 11th created a new economy, a vast economy of the iconic linking archive to traumatic public memory. It is my memory of what Enzor calls the economy of September 11th that flares up when I see geometric landscapes in the spectacle of force now as a digital reproduction on my computer screen. Its diminished scale yields itself to a powerful experience of empire, one that mirrors my experience of watching the events of September 11th as a series of images broadcast on the television screen. Against the memory of those television events, I turn to the rectangular shapes of skyscrapers that lie across the center of the drawing, which bisect and interrupt the photographic reproductions. Two buildings mirror each other. One is black, the other is white, both marked with a small cross. The white one you can't see in this image. A third structure is white with no windows, bearing what looks like a lightning bolt on its roof. Formally and stylistically disjunct from the amphitheaters and canopies, which are the photographic reproductions, it is these hand-drawn objects that suture the experience of seeing empire with my experience of being subject to empire in the United States. What I see in these buildings mapped over and above the photographic reproductions are the image archives of September 11th, an archive that has been so thoroughly domesticated that it has come to serve as a shorthand for memory. So I want to draw your attention to a structure at the extreme left of the drawing, the last structure that you can see on the left-hand side. It's a flat rectangular surface covered with a striped flag. I think you can see some sort of vertical stripes there. Positioned in front of a pixelated tower that has two crescent-shaped gashes, a tower that I read as mirroring the implosion of two World Trade Center, this object is hard to find. I read the flat surface of the object as a cenotaph and the stripes that cover it as remnants of an American flag. If we scan the drawing from left to right, beginning with the cenotaph, the pageantry of the darbar that unfolds across the canvas cannot be read solely as a depiction of 19th century British colonialism on the subcontinent. Instead, I propose a line of vision that begins with the invasion of Afghanistan and Pakistan by US troops following September 11th, the use of one terrorist attack to initiate the terrifying expansion of US empire on the subcontinent, in order to alter the timescale of the drawing. Reading the cenotaph, the stripes, and the skyscrapers as an alternate architectural landscape of empire across two continents, my experience of the drawing narrates the ties that bind British imperial authority with US military occupation in South Asia. Outside of this drawing, there are no monuments to those civilian deaths caused by drone attacks, missiles, and combat in South Asia, just as there is no monument to the colonization and partition of the subcontinent outside of the archival photographs and drawings of a quote-unquote undivided colonial India, which is an India that is already a spectral memory for post-colonial Pakistani and Indian subjects. To see Shah's architectural forms in relation to my memories of a visual archive of September 11th, and to see both in relation to the photographic reproductions of the monuments that compose the Darbar, means that we must come to terms with the fact that photography records what Roland Barthes has called a catastrophe which has already occurred. Yet in my viewing, the drawing does not simply record a single past catastrophe, whether the terror of colonial rule on the subcontinent or the decimation of a terrorist attack in New York City. Instead, the catastrophe that emerges out of the drawing, that exceeds every one of the iconic photographic forms that it archives, is the ongoing catastrophe of the US as a global empire. The performance theorist Peggy Phelan contends that the destruction that took place on September 11th is a kind of repetition, a historical event that contains its own mirror. She writes, the Twin Towers are themselves copies, doubles, if you will, that became the stage for the attack of two planes, the second shadowing the first. The repetition within the event, a repetition expressed both architecturally and geographically, was itself copied by photographs that circled the world. Mapping this doubling quality of September 11th onto Shah's drawings brings into relief the uncanny vision of empire that we see. If the drawing reproduces the architecture of the British Empire via the photographic images of two darbars, it also reproduces the crumbling twin towers via the skyscrapers that Shah plots across the canvas. In this reading of geometric landscapes, such spectacles of force echo across the horizontal line of the drawing. I want to stress that it is not that the shape or form of US empire in the 21st century mimics the scale and scope of the British Empire in the 20th. Quite the contrary. It is the affective experience, the felt impact of viewing one archival photographic image in the shadow of the archive of another set of contemporary images, that makes us see these built structures, one real and the other imagined, as doubles of each other. As I read photographs of the darbars alongside the online archive documenting the collapse of the World Trade Center on September 11th, I'm acutely aware that I'm scrambling histories, insisting on a symmetry between real and imagined landscapes built a century apart. But if I insist on joining together these two image archives, even in a drawing that explicitly relies only on one such archive, it is to stress that when we encounter a new aesthetic object that, quote unquote, represents a history of race and empire, our way of seeing that object is already saturated with what we have seen before. It is my familiarity with the commercial architecture of capitalism in New York City that alerts me to the pageantry of empire in New Delhi. Or to put it another way, the darbars come alive to us because the photographic archive of 9/11 keeps another set of monuments resolutely alive, always crumbling, always on the brink of death. Writing on the uses of history by Asian American visual artist David N. contends, we do not bring the present into the past. Rather, we bring the past into the present. We keep the past alive in the present by signifying and quickening through our desire those creatures and things that conventional culture would disavow and bury. As racialized subjects, our desire to see our own histories means that when we encounter the visual work of diasporic artists, our modes of seeing are already saturated with the affective charge of multiple image archives. Rather than disavow or bury archival objects, Shah's drawing explicitly reproduces one collection of images, that of the Delhi Darbars of 1903 and 1911. What is quickened through my own desire to have this drawing make sense to me as a South Asian American subject is another archive far removed from Shah's work, that is the online photographic and video archive of September 11th. If the past comes alive in the present, it does so precisely through the uncanny visions evoked by our diasporic viewing practices. Thank you.
Kelli Moore.
Okay, I changed my paper a little bit, given what I've seen in the titles of the papers offered so far. I wanted to offer more of a piece that had to do less with photography, which is what really grounds my work, and more with the sound, with the sonic. So my paper is To Say, Telecare and the Sonic Scene of Complaint. I've noticed that across the papers today, which were so beautiful, so wonderful, this question of lament, that word has occurred in a number of papers, as well as care. Okay, so the etymology of care, out of Old English, moving through Old High German, through Old Norse, means grief and lament, a variety of ways of articulating that. What I'm interested here in this etymology is the way in which the word care comes out of grief, but then as it develops in the West, becomes a domestic location in the sick bed, right? So I'm going to talk a little bit about how care ends up in a domestic space and what that means for state and militarily controlled institutions. I'm also going to read together in this paper, I'm going to read against or collide two public forms of assembly, and I'm quite interested in what may happen theoretically by doing so, and I would love in the question and answer period if you would say, Kelli, this works, or Kelli, this doesn't work, and you lose something or something terrible happens through this collision. So. Telecare has reorganized the home. Its reach into patients' lives and family and community dynamics is seconded only to the domestic incorporation of the television set, cable, and video game consoles. The ancient meaning of care included both anxious worry and a solicitude in caring for. The meaning concerns grief and a domestic location for the sounding of that grief. Recent scholarship attests to the difficulty theorizing the hybrid space of the university campus. My undergraduate students unanimously understand their relationship to me and the university space through the metaphor of family, for example. Teachers and administrators in their residence hall are like parents. The university campus as a whole is a home. The campus community is a family. A split between home, professional, and the milieu of the feast crowd. The American university campus is a tempting, yet nevertheless incorrect, space to discover metaphors of family. There's actually something to be gained in the work together that we do because of the fact that I'm not their mother, the fact that they are not my children. Thank goodness, right? Okay, and I'm going to bring, like I said, two cases together. In case one, the college campus, both private and public, is a control environment where the provision of telecare services has expanded expanded into the design of sexual assault reporting devices. The accusation of sexual assault is increasingly mediated and managed via online publics. Mainstream media accounts of campus sexual assault increasingly unfold across electronic social media. These accounts include claims and chains of evidence in our era of evidence-based prosecution. Paying attention to the normal incidence of sexual assault in college campuses identifies another necropolitical geography in institutions of higher education, one that is oriented more and more to time rather than distance. Trauma takes time to unfold, as we've seen throughout the papers today. One reason trauma is of interest as a form of communication from psychoanalysis to behavioralism is that self resists the recollection of traumatic experience. As a legally actionable category, trauma is something that must unfold over time. One must acknowledge that one has been raped, for example, and then further decide to enter into an adversarial form or system of redress. Sexual assault technologies, for recording assault, are a unique example of the deployment of crowdsourcing logic to populations that are in the process of developing or claiming an identity position, that of rape victim or rape survivor. Early constructivist accounts of telemedicine and telecare remarked how telemedical networks create health populations, what Lisa Cartwright calls remote locals, that quote, forge new concepts of community and identity through its identification of remote populations and expanded client catchment regions. In a short time, these same biomedical actuarial marketing techniques have expanded into explicit crowdsourcing devices and strategies. As Tyler Reigeluth remarks, quote, insofar as virtually anything can be discretized on and by electronic devices, digital technologies seem to involve an intensive and extensive materialization of our social interactions and experience through a dense technical networking of services, objects, institutions, and people, end quote. The university college campus has faced increasing scrutiny for its handling of sexual assault complaints. Right? We can see this in the Dear Betsy campaign that meant to really protest to and against Betsy DeVos and her understanding of sexual assault on campus. In an era of evidence-based prosecution, college reports of sexual violence are damning data points for U.S. institutions of higher learning. The complex agency of abused women, coupled with the patriarchal rape customs of the university space, establishes the school campus as a necropolitical technology. Far from being evidence of the discipline that manages the bare life of the college student, so colleges produce all sorts of statistics about the population, they have food and other forms of statistical production there. The normal incidence of sexual violence establishes the college campus as a site and management of social death. And here's an attempt on my part to bring together the work of Orlando Patterson on the question of social death and Sheila Mbembe's work on the camp, the necropolitics of the camp as a technology. The consequence of rape in college, whether one prosecutes the crime or not, is not solely psychical and psychological trauma, or physical and psychological trauma. Distress caused by violence is correlated to poor school performance, which may compromise financial scholarships and a student's ability to remain in school. More important, the decision to report immediately jeopardizes existing peer relationships and horizons for social interaction, as victims with complex agency, right, experiencing that trauma, can experience intense desire to both avoid and further interact with their abuser and his or her friends and associates. So here, part of what I'm talking about in this paper is that technologies, so the whole literature of telecare is really technophilic, and what I think we need are more theories of telecare from the perspective of those whose barren social lives are monitored and managed electronically by mass state and corporate institutions. Okay, well, actually. Currently, Title IX complaint to end rape on campus, I'm sure you can find it these websites here, is making its way through the U.S. courts. The EROC complaint is comprised by interpenetrating media forms. EROC exists as a legal complaint, a document under file in the court docket, a website, and blogs informing students of the anti-discrimination complaint and how they can donate time. So this is about equal access to education in the aftermath of assault. In this context, the female trauma survivor has become a significant figure in forming the design protocols of sexual assault reporting technologies. The complex agency that characterizes survivors of sexual and gender assault is a well-known debate in U.S. criminal jurisprudence. Complex agency comes out of the work of sociologist Carrie Baker, who affirms the contradictory temporal and contingent nature of battered women's behavior. The time, space, and place of sexual assault reporting is undisciplined, unknown. Let's skip over here. Telecare in college serves the unique needs of university campus hybrid domestic space and the complex nature of traumatic response. Historically, many college campuses in the U.S. offer student-run rape hotlines through some form of campus health service. Thus, the rape hotline is part of a feminist media history, a sonic scene for the emergence of vocal lament and complaint. And the following devices expand this feminist media history. Callisto, invented by a college student formerly, Jessica Ladd, Harass Map, and Fight Back are 3 mobile technologies designed to assist victims of gender and sexual assault and violence. They are third-party sexual assault reporting technologies designed by nonprofit activists and for-profit entities alike and are currently marketed to universities and private individuals. What is distinctive about such electronic reporting databases and how they model or enact something called information escrow, a process allowing one to store a time-stamped encrypted assault report to be released in the event in a pre-chosen number of corroborating reports when they're logged by other victims. At an institutional level, information escrow is a legal process that allows subscribers to collect and study sexual harassment and violence on campus. Significant to my study is the temporal intervention Callisto, Harass Map, and Fight Back offer members through information escrow, where hesitant and fearful victims have prolonged opportunities to initiate sexual assault claims. So what this kind of what these apps do is they move the conversation from he said, she said to he said, they said, right? Information escrows allow people to transmit sensitive information to a trusted intermediary, an escrow agent, who only forwards the information under pre-specified conditions. For example, an allegation escrow for sexual harassment might allow a victim to place a private complaint into escrow with instructions that the complaint be lodged with proper authorities only if the escrow agent receives at least one additional allegation against the same individual. There are many kinds of information escrows: allegation, whistleblowing, suspicion escrow models, and so on. A distinctive feature of sexual assault allegation escrows is that narratives of trauma inform the database structure. This is partly because victim activists and allies, who are typically women, have pioneered design initiatives, right? And so what I'm interested in here is actually a form of gamification that becomes at play in these technologies. Assault allegation escrows thus reflect the gamification of social life. They play on an ethos of immediacy that telecare devices circulate. Gamification is designed and deployed in the key of neoliberal government feminism that resonates with derivative financial transactions or cultures of finance. Telecare is thus not simply concerned with colonizing domestic space, but also to making alternate forms of time, carving time out of time through the phenomenon of social media following behavior. So I can talk a little bit more about that, but I actually want to move on to the next case. And that has to do with the case of community bail fund nullification. In the practice of community bail fund nullification, community members collectively post bail to strangers who are exposed to jail time. Bail money is the amount of a defendant's personal money a judge determines necessary to release said defendant back into the community until subsequent court appearances. For poor defendants unable to pay these fees, these hearings effectively become trials where defendants submit guilty pleas that expose them to long pretrial jail detention in an effort to avoid monetary extraction from the courts. Where the victim of sexual assault is encouraged to game the timing of her accusations, the criminal defendant is reduced to gaming the body, financially coerced into submitting their bodies to jail time to avoid paying expensive bail. This then is a situation of risk society that community bail funds disrupt. In the context of the society of risk, consumers of telemedical services have something in common with indigent criminal defendants, those not yet in jail but under threat of imprisonment while awaiting arraignment. Like chronic medical patients, the criminal defendant is exposed to the risk of incarceration. Community jail funds are an important example of telecare because they often happen through mobile devices that should be included in this literature. They are an indigent crowdsourcing activity that brings together a form of collective dissent while recalling the media history of the telephone as an instrument of sentimental and familial attachment emerging in the 19th century. Telephones and the sentimental care practices they deliver are significant communication forms that mediate parenting while incarcerated. The telephone and the care enunciated across its cables takes on an extra burden for the children and lovers of geographically marginalized, such as the incarcerated. A number of researchers in the fields of public health, community psychology, and sociology examine the telecare networks of incarcerated parents and their children. Talking on the telephone to imprisoned parents decreases child morbidity, stabilizes participation in school, while also ensuring that reuniting, when possible, with an imprisoned parent is less traumatic for children and parents. Significant numbers of poor children conduct relationships with parents almost exclusively by telephone. And this is in particular not just a poor issue, but an issue that is included in Blackness itself, in the way many times Black folks who are separated from their children, from their families, communicate. Like that is the line. Although indigent defendants often choose bail at pretrial over paying crippling bail fees, once incarcerated, they are then subject to crippling telephone service charges and recorded conversations, or further geographical marginalization. The prison phone extends telecare into the home as much as any medical device that monitors the vital signs of the patient. Like the university space, the jail telephone further hybridizes domestic space for those with an incarcerated family member. And I'll actually stop there. I think we've got enough material to talk about during question and answer. But my real question about these two groups, by trying to collide them together, is to think about the ways in which the telephone and mobile apps, I'm wondering what kind of we is the they, basically. What kind of we gets established through the use of these kinds of sexual assault reporting devices, and what might happen when we collide that with the kind of we that gets established through the community bail fund, those people who help citizens raise money for their bail, and the way that it challenges the judge's understanding of community safety and who exactly needs to be a part of the community, who can return home or not. Thank you.
And Jyoti Puri.
Thank you so much. Thanks for your help. And thank you to Vanessa for shepherding us. And I decided I was going to break with convention and not thank Kimberly for this wonderful space and for including me in it. So no thanks given. And I'm particularly not going to thank her for all of that invisible labor that goes into creating the space, sustaining it, and organizing events like these. So, this is somewhat of a departure from my previous work that Vanessa so kindly introduced. And this is, in fact, the very first time I'm actually publicly presenting some of this work. Find myself very fortunate to do it in this space, and I would particularly welcome your feedback as a result of that. So. I have been haunted by this photograph for many years. It lingered with me, presenting itself at unexpected moments, even though I lost track of it during migrations to new laptops. But it was really the image text that left the impact. Curated by Tejinder Singh Sibia, this photograph was annotated 1907, funeral for the first Sikh who died in Vancouver in 1907. No permission was granted by the mayor or others. They took the deceased to a distant forest in the middle of the night and cremated the body in the morning. My response was visceral. My stomach tightened as I looked at the photo, imagining what it must have been like for the early South Asian migrants to confront death in a foreign land, to perform the death rites furtively in the wilderness, to be denied even the grace of one's cultural religious beliefs, to be forced to somehow transport the body in the middle of the night and cremate it in the morning on a makeshift pyre, all because the mayor and other officials didn't see it fit to permit a cremation within the town limits. While the rest of the image got fuzzy, what stayed with me over the years is the South Asian man in the foreground standing amidst the forest debris, perhaps because a subsequent search led me to this sliver from the larger image. In fact, as you'll see, there are two images, and they were basically split up into 5. So it looked like there were 5, but in fact, they were drawn out of 2. He's the one I most clearly remembered, hands in his pockets, looking down pensively at the scene. He is the one who stirred questions about what it is like to face death out of time, but also death out of place. Would I, too, die here without reconciling with this place? A place where I am yet to feel at home some 30 years later? The estrangement of death confronted us both. My first encounter with death was also through text images. Indian comic books called Amar Chitra Katha, or Immortal Picture Stories. Begun in 1967 by Anant Pai, these illustrated stories were meant to restore us children of colonialism to a landscape of mythological stories and historical events, which is what led me to the god of death, Lord Yama. This particular story is about Savitri, whose devotion, resolve, and wit won back her husband's life from Lord Yama. Savitri marries Satyavan, despite knowing that he would die a year later. But when Lord Yama comes to take Satyavan's soul, she follows them through the forest and into the mountains. In this space where life and death are suspended, Savitri outwits the god of death, who congenially admits his defeat and restores Satyavan's life. Like most recuperative projects, these comic books were hardly innocent of the pitfalls of religion, caste, gender, sexuality, and the racialized politics of colorism. You can sort of see that. And Savitri's name has gone from being synonymous with ideal Indian womanhood to pure irony. At the same time, it was an illustration of the impermanence of not only life, but also death, and of death's fluid time spaces. At a moment when anti-immigrant discourses are rife in the US and elsewhere, what do the lives, or more precisely, the deaths of South Asian immigrants to North America have to teach us? Death, perhaps more than life, reveals the cultural rituals that provide a blueprint for funerary practices and mourning. But what happens when these cultural practices are out of sync with state and social provisions for the disposal of bodies and grieving? Or when these practices have to be navigated, reinvented, or fought for by immigrant communities? Studying death among South Asian migrants reveals the fault lines of race, religion, and nation under conditions of settler colonialism and colonial rule, the aftermath of slavery, empires, diasporas, white supremacy, and nativism. Its visual archive unearths tensions between prohibition and spectacle, the fear of and fascination with fire, and evidentiary and imaginary photography in ways that speaks to the histories of Native American funerary practices, but also lynching and the exclusion of immigrants of color at the turn of the 20th century. It encourages the need to rethink death as cessation of time toward grappling with questions of impermanence and death's enduring relationship to land and space. As profound as first impressions are, they are also partial. Sight is dependent on perception, and memory is incomplete at best. Seeing the first image with fresh eyes, I registered the more than 20 mostly Sikh, but also possibly Hindu or Muslim men, and the cluster of white men and boys on the right. I don't know if you can see them, but they're just on the right side of the image. Perhaps I just didn't see past the South Asian men in the photo, but now I attend closely to the details. The casket neatly draped in dark cloth, placed on a bed of logs, the hunched shoulders and folded hands of the men encircling the casket, one just off-center among his kinsmen, his body slightly turned away, perhaps distracted by the camera, the stances of the white onlookers, and the camera's unfettered access. There is also a second image, taken later, centering the funeral pyre, showing the flames at the bottom and billowing smoke blurred from the slow click of the camera. As time shifts, so does the perception of space. The angle of the camera closes in on the burning pyre. The light is different, and fewer South Asian men remain, while white bystanders have taken their places. Neither temporality nor spatiality of the scene appears fixed. The first of the two photos is located in Vancouver, whereas the other is placed in Todd Inlet, and I'm going by the annotations at the Vancouver Public Library, which is around 100 kilometers outside of the city. Known as Sneed Quoth by the Saanich First Nation, it was the site of a cement plant which employed Chinese and Sikh migrants, exposing them to high rates of tuberculosis and silicosis, as Manmohan Singh Wirk notes. Due to dust from cement and the coal bags that were required to carry. I'm going to start this again. So this was about exposing the Sikh and Chinese migrants to high rates of tuberculosis and silicosis, as Manmohan Singh Wirk notes, due to dust from cement and the coal bags that they were required to carry, resulting in the death of Targul Singh, who is being cremated in the photos. Targul Singh and other South Asians were part of the British imperial circuit, whereby subjects dislocated from one colonial outpost sought recourse in another, becoming economic and political migrants and refugees. Although the dubious virtue of being subjects of the British Crown should have allowed them entry into Canada, they were frequently prohibited due to nativist and white supremacist policies, which were earlier honed during efforts to exclude Chinese immigrants. By 1906, there were an estimated 1,500 South Asians around the Vancouver region, and their lives were made difficult by unrelenting racism. The racism culminated a few months later in the Bellingham riot that then reverberated around Vancouver and beyond, leading to the expulsion of the South Asian migrants. This may have well been the first time that these South Asian men and their deceased kinsmen figured into photographs, but the historical mix of colonialism and photography had previously rendered them subjects. Photography arrived in India within months of its development in Europe and gained more traction after the watershed 1857 uprising. In this context, as in other colonial outposts, photography functioned as a colonial arm serving its racialized, anthropological, and forensic needs. In North America, photography and other visual technologies played a particularly decisive role in producing subjectivities aligned with the imperatives of settler colonialism and slavery. Such technologies were crucial to generating what Robert Berghofer Jr. called, and I quote, the white man's Indian, and by the turn of the 20th century, were being actively used across Canada and the US to document the arguably vanishing Indian. Illustrated in compilations such as Edward Curtis's The North American Indian, published between 1907 and 1930, Daniel Francis notes that these images were carefully staged with subjects, props, and corrected to remove evidence of white culture. While Sikhs were featured in Indian colonial archives primarily as soldiers and warriors, in a way that Bakirathi was also referring to, photographers in the North American context recorded them in their capacities as migrant labor. Images of sick men in the Pacific Northwest arriving into ports, working on railroad construction and such, are present alongside the cremation photo in the archive that was first assembled by Sibia. Alongside the anthropological renderings of six are also examples of visuals that resonate with what Kimberly Juanita Brown, Jasmine Cobb, and other scholars have argued, that photography did not only have a defining influence on how slavery was known and understood, but it also reimagined and reconstructed representations of Black subjectivity before and after the end of slavery. Examples in Sibia's archive include mostly sick men, dressed in their finery, including their military uniforms and colonial insignias earned as soldiers, but also sharp European suits that are in the idiom of the family photograph. Indeed, migrant communities have left records of the ephemerality of death and the iterative practices of homemaking. Dating from the late 19th into the early 20th century, many such images exist of funeral gatherings and processions among Japanese migrants in Hawaii. These panoramic photos were part of customs that were previously established in Japan, freezing the moments when the dead are still part of the living. Such images present a genealogical portrait that binds together not just the histories of those who are gone with those who remain, but also what is especially important to the story of migration. Here we are here. Surely then, the archive is not just about the colonial gaze, but also what Courtney Baker has usefully described as the variegated practice of looking. But these complexities are mostly lost in the intrusive photos of the cremation. Consider here another image attributed to Bourne and Shepard, the first photo studio in Asia established in 1860s. In an image circa 1870s of a body being prepared for cremation, all is revealed to the viewer for a probing visual examination. Her prostrate body on a pile of logs in a shallow pit, her tonsured hair, her head, her uncovered torso, the priest performing the last rites, the four women squatting around the body, and a young man with a vessel in hand. The up-close view arouses, titillates, satisfies, and perhaps even horrifies the distant viewer, blurring the lines between pornography and posthumous photography. This, even as one of the squatting women, her head covered, arms on her knees and hands interlocked, returns the camera's unrelenting gape, reminding us that some encroachments do not diminish with time. On closer inspection, the first cremation image turns out to be a yellowing postcard. At the same time, it was not unusual for photos to be developed into picture cards, which in this case is 19 centimeters by 14 centimeters. Although this is different from the format of the postcard, which popularizes the photo as commodity in an age of mass visual reproduction, they are not unrelated. Reading lynching picture cards along with other visual formats such as stereographs, Jacqueline Goldsby emphasizes the aesthetics of visual technology that shaped how lynching was depicted and seen by a national viewership. Even though picture cards by the late 19th century were widely popular in the US, being easily handled, collected, and exchanged, the power of lynching picture cards, she compellingly argues, lay in their scarcity, unpredictability, and irregularity. I'll just finish one paragraph and stop there. Cremation images at the end of the century were hardly being mass-produced. Although here is another cremation. This one is entitled Hindu, but is most likely Sikh, in Arrowhead in British Columbia in postcard format. But as the annotations on the cremation images that I began with indicate, the first image has a copy negative, which suggests that if the original negative were to be lost, it would be still possible to produce more pictures. The negative for the second cremation image appears to have survived, and what also exists is a relatively large copy print. Thus, these and other photos of cremations in North America in the North American West lie somewhere between mass production and the scarcity of lynching picture cards, and their purpose lies somewhere between generating pretty pictures and satisfying the desires for spectacles. So where I go from here is to think through the tensions between prohibitions and restrictions around immigrant cremations and making of visual spectacles. This at the same moment when white elites are turning to cremation as a modern alternative to burial, while distancing themselves from the suppression of crematory practices among some Native American communities. I dwell on the role of fire in the white Christian imagination, ranging from the destruction of cities, forests, its sonic qualities, but also its symbolic and material use to destroy, the burning of witches, the use of fire to lynch, or where lynchings ended with the burning of the body, as well as its association with the burning of widows in South Asia. The work continues, and I welcome your feedback.
Okay, we have time for questions. I'd just like to have you all keep in mind the feedback that the panelists were looking for.
Thank you all for the presentations. I was thinking about, Kelly Moore, your question about the applications. And part of what, I haven't completely formed the response, but I was thinking about how we understand violation in body and whether or not that's an individual understanding or one that happens in conversation. And I'm thinking about that the people who are likely to put something in an app alone, it's very different from the people who are, I mean, I know that I've come to awareness about things that have happened with my body in conversation with other women in a way that an app doesn't, that wouldn't be represented in an application. And I also just thought about I mean, you didn't mention it, but I know that the Mother's Day bailout is coming up again, and I don't know if that was the kind of thing we were thinking about, but how that, for me, is connected to political community. But so I see those two apps as tapping into different kinds of communities. I see the one as being a much more individualistic understanding of body and not being created in conversation, but for me, like the Mother's Day bailout thing is completely this is my political community conversation.
Thank you for that. I agree. And one of the reasons that I'm interested in bringing these two groups together is precisely that tension where for so-called women's matters or women's issues, particularly as a white body is typically the model for that kind of plea or complaint that seeks redress for sexual violation, there is a way in which the app, I think, imagines an individual approach. That when you think then about something like the community bailout, even in its name, right, even as you bring up the Mother's Day bailout that's also approaching, it's a very different model. And so I'm interested in bringing precisely those kinds of approaches together, those ways of grieving, lamenting, the role of technology, and sort of what kind of we is imagined in both of those forms of assembly, and thinking more about how when you apply questions about race and gender to that kind of lament or grieving, you get very interesting, you get very different political histories that enact forms of redress, right? So I thank you for that. That's exactly what I'm up to. Yeah, and different kinds of redress. That's exactly what I'm up to. So, yeah. Thank you.
Given that you asked us to think about this, I definitely have been trying to connect those two instances, those two communities, and I couldn't help but think about the who is implicated in the application. Like, it seems as if the redress would be connected to the prison industrial complex in a way that the bailout is also like the other side of that. So I feel like there's a connection there from victim and perpetrator, in which the prison industrial complex is called up. I also think class is one of those places that there's a connection between race and gender and class, and so who has access to a smartphone, or who can understand their body as one that's worth protecting, that would then be able to use an application to understand what happened to them as something like sexual harassment, even if it isn't sexual violence, like something that is sexual harassment is often hard to note. Yeah. And then just like the expansion of the police state that is on the other side of that app is something that I kept thinking about. And all the images were of, I think, people who are gendered as men in the imagery. And so the kind of gendered relationship between those two different groups of people. And then my question is around bare life and social death and necropolitics. Like, how are those connected in each? I wasn't clear about how you were thinking about those in each of those instances. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks again. I've really, some of this work has really led me to think about the university as a space and the kinds of claims that get made around rape, which is, again, a normal, regular, routine practice. It's to make that point, right, that the campus at the university, the neoliberal university, is a camp space in which those kinds of death politics are enacted. Death, yes. I mean, especially if we consider fraternity culture and the kinds of deaths that happen under hazing rituals or things like that. But the kind of social death that happens for the student afterward in their ability to get education and being ostracized. So those are the ways I'm trying to bring those concepts together. But I'm also trying to bring this work to light in a moment where we realize, yes, there's, again, this connection between the university space and the prison industrial complex, but also around the pleasure that we take around women programmers. Because the programmers of these technologies, these apps are women, right? And we think about Black Girls Code, that's wonderful news. No one's upset about Black Girls Code, right? So I'm trying to bring together, the kind of underside of neoliberal working in the university space as a source of a variety of opportunities for women programmers around rape, but then again, sort of throw that into relief with prison industrial, with what's happening with bail, which still seems, rather archaic, and people don't think that the kind of activism that's going on there is nearly as innovative, for example, as something like the programming that goes into making these apps. So I really want to see those kinds of online and offline and in between forms of activism and really bring them together in a way that's theoretically productive, but I'm concerned. I have some concern about my own reasons to bring it together.
I have two questions, one for Tara, one for Jyoti, and it kind of flips us back to the previous panel, because I'm actually really curious about the haptic dimensions of both of your archives. So the haptic dimensions of the listing and double bookkeeping, and a double bookkeeping that is not simply about transactions, right? So what inspires somebody to archive themselves in this deeply colonial modality, right? And it's just really, really remarkable. And even within that, what you were talking about the sort of the haptic dimensions of his penmanship, which is again another like deeply colonized, modality. And so I was hoping you could say something about that. And Jyoti, your archive, I wonder who kept and circulated those images. right? For whom were they so precious that they made the trip forward in time into these particular archives? And was it a community thing, right? Was it handed down through a community? Yeah, because it's just, its survival itself is such a gorgeous, testament to somebody's love of this particular, or their investment in this particular ritual.
So that's what I really like about Cesar Lyndon, is that he seems very much a part of the colonial enterprise. He is complicit, and at least what I can tell about him presently. I mean, and there's still a lot more work that I need to do to think about Cesar Lyndon and his account book. But all in all, I think that his decision to archive or to remember or to make note of his interactions is very much connected to the business that he is helping to run. And I think that what has me return to him again and again at this point is wrestling with the fact that he's, as I suggested, so complicit. His handwriting is beautiful. It's supposed to be beautiful because he's the one who has to copy everything down. His master is also a clerk for the Rhode Island General Assembly. So I think that there's an interesting genealogy of clerks who are ultimately writing things down to be preserved, to be remembered, to be archived. And I think that while Josias Lyndon may seem like the obvious remnant, instead it's Cesar Lyndon who is so well cataloged. It's Cesar Lyndon who is making note of so many interactions, and I think that the account book that's at the Rhode Island Historical Society is only one half of his account book. There's also a ledger that's even cuter than the one that is actually there. The handwriting is even better. So I don't necessarily have the why as an answer, but certainly that observation is what has me so inclined to talk about Cesar Lyndon all the time, which is currently what I do.
Tina, thank you so much. Is this on? Okay, sorry, I couldn't hear it. Thank you so much for that question. So the way I understand it, or what I've been able to piece together so far, is that the Jinder Singh Sibia was a librarian in the UC system, and he's the one who really created that first archive that was available online for quite a bit, which is how a friend of mine saw that photograph and then shared it with me many, many years ago. And then because of some sort of concerns, because these photographs were sourced from multiple families, there was some concern, and so they took that off and now are in the process of kind of recataloging and reestablishing that website. But so I think, as you were already hinting, it was sort of passed down in certain families, but also through Sikh temples. And Sikh temples historically have been really important repositories of history. And they have been, that's sort of been one of the mechanisms through which some of these records have survived, not only photographs, but also letters and other things that have been digitized over a period of time. So in that sense, I think what was in some ways embedded in your question, that it is this kind of collective shared history, which makes it, I think, all that more poignant.
Thank you for your presentations. I have two questions for Tara. So the first concerns Cesar Lyndon's broader context. I mean, he's in Rhode Island, right, which is the epicenter of slave trading in the Western Hemisphere. So yes. I'm wondering how much of...
That should be said all the time.
Right. So I'm wondering how much you think this mode of recording arises out of that very particular culture, right? And then second, in terms of thinking about African American literature, what it is and what it is not, I wonder how productive it might be for you to think about Lyndon in relationship to someone like Venture Smith. And I know that, Smith didn't write his own narrative, he recounted it. But in terms of like the deep fiscal and effective accounting that goes on in Venture Smith, where he's constantly talking about this history of being, plundered out of money, plundered out of acreage, and he keeps great detail, right? I lost this amount of dollars. They stole this amount of land from me. And even when his children die, very often it's, if my child hadn't have died, and I already paid half of their manumission, but I've lost me. So I'm wondering if there's some type of way to think of, and he was also enslaved in New England and had some overlap in Rhode Island, I believed, in some instances. So I'm wondering if Smith might be an interesting, sort of interlocutor to think about in relationship to Lyndon, writing at the end of the 18th century.
So I always think about Rhode Island and its slavery problem, or it's money. It's slavery money. I was at Brown yesterday, and I was like, oh my God, all this slavery money. So I think that it's certainly not lost on me that Cesar Lyndon's account book is one of what had to have been many in and around Newport. And I know, to return to Brown, John Carter Brown Library has a ton of account books. So one of the things that I want to do is to look at other account books that are contemporaneous with Cesar Lyndon and also see how they talk to one another, because I imagine that they are talking to the same set of names depending on where folks are. So, if I had to think about the biggest names that I've come across, they are folks that still have money today, of course. Their names are still on buildings in Rhode Island. So, yeah, streets, all of that. So that is one thing that I've not done yet, but I definitely have a mind to that. And before Cesar Lyndon, I didn't think very much about money or representations of money in early African-American literature, just because that wasn't my interest. But I think in addition to Venture Smith, Phyllis Wheatley also keeps accounts as well of her transactions with her books. And the Free African Union Society also does. The African Female Society of Newport also does. So once I started looking for people actually tracking dollars and cents who are Black, it's relatively commonplace, even though admittedly Phyllis Wheatley isn't keeping something that is an actual account book. The Free African Union Society is not keeping at least I don't know of, an actual account book. So I think that part of what I would love to kind of press upon scholars of early America or early African-American literature more specifically is to pay attention to the way that the actual accounts are kept and to attend to that language. Because I haven't heard many folks talk about the fact that Phyllis Wheatley is selling her books by way of a Black woman in Newport, Rhode Island, right? Isn't that surprising? Yeah, so Uber Tanner is selling Wheatley's books, and Phyllis Wheatley is like, oh, thanks for the money. Here's 300 more books. 300 books you're selling in Newport, Rhode Island? Okay. So, yeah, I'm thinking about all of that.
Thank you. We have dinner this evening where lots more conversation can be had around this. And this ends today's panels. And I'm going to turn it over to Kimberly. Oh, yeah. Oh, and one more minute? One more talk. Oh, one more talk. No, I know. That's why I meant panels are done. Okay. Yes, we do. We do have more. Sorry. Because I was letting you know that I would be done.
Thank you, Vanessa. Great job.
Oh, yeah.